Here is something that was treated as settled science for more than 10 years. If your roots trace back to Africa and nowhere else, you carry no Neanderthal DNA at all. Zero. A clean line. At least, that is what everyone believed. Then a team at Princeton built a new tool, pointed it at 2,500 DNA samples from around the world, and found Neanderthal DNA in every single group they looked at, Africa included. Which left a far stranger question. If everyone on Earth carries this DNA, which group carries the most, and what does that number actually mean? If you want the kind of deep dives that take a single, strange number and follow it all the way down, subscribe now. This channel covers ancient origins and the science quietly rewriting them every week. 15 years before any of this, the answer to that question did not exist, because the question itself made no sense. Neanderthals were a closed file. The agreement among scientists through most of the 20th century was blunt. They were a separate species, a heavy-browed side branch that lived hard, went extinct around 40,000 years ago, and left nothing behind. A failed branch, a line of humans that simply stopped. The idea that a living person could be walking around with Neanderthal DNA in their cells was not a long-shot idea. It was simply not on the table. Scientists across the field believed the two groups never had children together at all, and that if they somehow had, those children would not have been able to have kids of their own, the way a mule cannot. That belief held for a long time. It held because nobody could test it. You cannot compare human DNA to Neanderthal DNA until you have Neanderthal DNA, and ancient DNA does not survive well. It shatters into tiny pieces. It picks up DNA from every scientist who ever handled the bone. For decades, pulling a usable set of DNA out of a fossil tens of thousands of years old was seen as almost impossible. Then a lab in Leipzig did it anyway. The Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, led by a gene scientist named Svante Pääbo, spent years working out ways to pull out and read damaged ancient DNA without burying it under modern DNA. In 2010, his team published the first draft of the full Neanderthal DNA, put together mostly from bone pieces found in Vindija Cave in Croatia. For the first time in history, scientists had the actual DNA of a human species that had gone extinct sitting next to the DNA of living people. So they did the obvious thing, they compared them, and here is where the settled science started to fall apart. The Neanderthal DNA was not a stranger to human DNA, it was a relative that had clearly been in the room. People with European and Asian roots carried stretches of DNA that matched the Neanderthal DNA far too closely to be chance. Not a trace, not background noise. Real, countable, inherited Neanderthal DNA sitting in the DNA of billions of living people. The number, on average, came in around 2%. That sounds small until you sit with what it means. 2% of the DNA of every non-African person alive is not human, strictly speaking. It is Neanderthal. It came from a group that has been extinct for 40,000 years, and it is still being passed down parent to child right now in every generation. And it does not just sit there. The Neanderthal stretches that survived in us are not just genetic fossils sitting quietly in a corner of our DNA. Some of them do real work. Neanderthals had lived in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived, long enough to adapt to its cold, its weaker sunlight, and its local diseases. When humans had children with them, they inherited a piece of all that hard-won survival in a single generation. Neanderthal gene versions in living people have been linked to how the body fights off illness, to skin and hair color, and to how the body handles cold. The DNA was a shortcut. Modern humans walked into a strange new continent and, by mixing with the species already shaped by it, skipped tens of thousands of years of slow evolution. That is part of why so much of it survived. It was not baggage. For the people carrying it, a lot of it was a real help. And the version you have probably heard at this point is where the story usually stops. Humans met Neanderthals, humans and Neanderthals had children together, modern non-Africans carry about 2%. Clean, tidy. But that 2% is an average, and an average hides everything interesting. Because the moment scientists stopped looking at the species as a whole and started comparing group to group, the tidy number fell apart. Through the 2010s, separate teams ran the same basic test on a bigger and bigger scale. Sriram Sankararaman and David Reich at Harvard mapped Neanderthal pieces across hundreds of DNA samples. Benjamin Vernat and Joshua Akey, then at the University of Washington, did it with their own separate method. Different labs, different methods, different samples. They kept finding the same thing. and it was not what anyone expected. The 2% was not spread evenly. People in East Asia, people with Chinese, Japanese, and Korean roots were carrying clearly more Neanderthal DNA than people in Europe, not a rounding error. Depending on the study, people in East Asia carried somewhere between 8 and 24% more Neanderthal DNA than people in Europe. Measured in raw DNA, the average East Asian person holds around 54 megabases of Neanderthal DNA. The average European holds closer to 49. Native American groups who come from those same East Asian ancestors sit right up at the top alongside them. And that is not a measuring mistake, by the way. 4 different labs using 4 different methods kept landing on the same gap. The signal was real. East Asian people were carrying the most. But finding out who carries the most was only round 1. Because the moment you have that fact, you run straight into a problem that should not have an answer. Neanderthals never lived in East Asia. Sit with that. Every fossil we have, every site, every scrap of evidence from the digs places Neanderthals in Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Western and Central Asia. Their world ended somewhere around the Altai Mountains. They never reached China. They never reached Japan. They never reached Korea. The people who today carry the heaviest dose of Neanderthal DNA come from groups that lived thousands of miles from the nearest Neanderthal. So how does a group that never shared a single valley with Neanderthals end up carrying more of their DNA than the group that lived right on top of Neanderthal land? The people of ancient Europe were in the same valleys, hunting the same animals, sheltering in the same caves Neanderthals had used for 100,000 years. By every gut feeling, they should carry the most. They carry less. If the story had stopped at that puzzle, it would just be an odd little fact, a footnote in a science paper. It did not stop there. The answer, when it finally came, did not just solve the puzzle. It flipped it. Before we get into that, if this is the kind of thing you want more of, the slow pulling apart of a fact everyone thought was simple, take a second and subscribe. It really helps this channel reach the people who would actually sit through a 20-minute video about ancient DNA. So scientists had a puzzle. East Asians carry the most, and Neanderthals never lived there. But the answer that solved it made the first puzzle look almost gentle next to it. For years, there were 2 main ideas. The first was simple. Maybe East Asians carry more because their ancestors had children with Neanderthals a second time. The idea goes like this. A single group leaves Africa, meets Neanderthals, picks up that first dose of DNA. Then that group splits. One branch heads toward Europe, the other heads east. And somewhere along that path east, the argument went, that branch ran into Neanderthals again and topped up. A second pulse. More contact, more DNA. It is a clean story. It fits the gut feeling that more Neanderthal DNA must mean more time spent with Neanderthals. And for a while, it was the main answer. And if a second pulse were the only thing the data pointed to, the case might have closed there. But the DNA kept refusing to cooperate. When scientists tested that second meeting idea carefully, the numbers never quite fit. The amount of extra DNA was too steady, too even, to come from a messy string of separate meetings spread across a continent. Something cleaner was going on. Something that had nothing to do with East Asians at all. In 2023, a team led by Claudio Quilodron and Matthias Kurat, working with ancient DNA databases built in part by David Reich's lab, shared the answer in the journal Science Advances. And it flipped the entire question on its head. The reason East Asians carry the most Neanderthal DNA is not that East Asians gained anything. It is that Europeans lost it. Which, when you think about how the question had been asked for over 10 years, is a pretty big thing to have backwards. Here is how it worked. Roughly 10,000 years ago, farming began to spread out of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, into Europe. It did not spread as an idea passed from neighbor to neighbor. It spread as people. Waves of early farmers actually moved across the continent. And over thousands of years, they mostly replaced or absorbed the hunter-gatherer groups who were already living there. And here is the part that matters. Those incoming farmers carried less Neanderthal DNA than the hunter-gatherers they were replacing. Why those farmers carried less is a thread of its own. Europe before farming was home to hunter-gatherer groups that held a fairly high level of Neanderthal DNA. The Anatolian farmers who moved in came from a different family line, one whose Neanderthal signal had already been thinned earlier in its past. So this was never one clean event. It was a stacked set of migrations, each carrying a slightly different dose of Neanderthal DNA, each mixing into the groups it met along the way. Europe sat at a crossroads for these movements in a way East Asia simply did not, and every wave that crossed through left the Neanderthal percentage there a little lower than it found it. So every time a farming group moved into an area and blended with the locals, the Neanderthal signal in that area got watered down, thinned out, spread thinner. Wave after wave, generation after generation, the percentage across Europe kept dropping. East Asia never got that flood of low Neanderthal farmers in the same way. The watering down never reached it at the same scale. So East Asia's Neanderthal DNA stayed closer to its first level, while Europe's quietly drained away under everyone's feet. And this is the detail that explains the whole puzzle. The East Asians did not climb to the top of the list, they simply stood still while everyone around them slid down. The group carrying the most Neanderthal DNA on Earth holds that title because of something missing. Because of something that did not happen to them. The number is not a record of contact. It is a record of what the rest of the world lost. Up to this point, the story has been about a gap between two groups, Europe and East Asia. That gap was about to get much wider. Because there was still one group the whole field had quietly written out of the picture. Africa. For more than 10 years, the working rule was that African groups south of the Sahara carried no Neanderthal DNA. Zero. And the logic seemed airtight. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Asia. The mixing happened after modern humans left Africa. So the people who never left, and all their families after them, never met Neanderthals, and never got the DNA. That belief did not just sit quietly in the background, it got built directly into the tools. The usual methods for spotting Neanderthal DNA worked by comparison. They would take a test DNA sample, compare it against an African sample that was assumed to carry no Neanderthal DNA, and mark the differences as Neanderthal. The African sample was the blank slate, the 0 point, the thing everything else was measured against. The empty result was never measured. It was assumed, and then wired into the very tool that was supposed to measure it. And no, that is not a stretch. It is how they worked. Then in 2020, Joshua Akey's lab at Princeton built a different kind of tool. They called it IBD Mix, and its key feature was that it did not need an African sample assumed to be clean. It could search for Neanderthal DNA directly, without first deciding where the answer was not allowed to be. They pointed it at 2,504 DNA samples from the 1,000 Genomes Project, a worldwide collection that included groups from Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Gambia, and Kenya. And the African samples were not empty. Every African group they tested carried Neanderthal DNA. The amount was smaller than in people from Europe and Asia, somewhere around a third of their level, but it was clearly there. The clean line did not exist. It never had. It had just never been looked for, because everyone already knew what the answer would be. And the paper did not stop at simply finding the DNA. The answer for how it got there made the picture stranger still. Most of that African Neanderthal DNA, Akey's team found, came from back migration. Over the last 20,000 years or so, groups from Europe and Asia, carrying their Neanderthal pieces, moved back into Africa and mixed with the people already there. The DNA made a round trip. Out of Africa, into the Neanderthals' world, and home again, tens of thousands of years later. But there was a second source, and it ran the other direction. The data also showed that some of the shared DNA was modern human DNA that had gone into Neanderthals. An early group of humans had left Africa long before the main move out, met Neanderthals, and left a human genetic mark inside the Neanderthals' own DNA. Gene flow was never one way, it went both directions. Humans changed Neanderthals and Neanderthals changed us. So by 2020, the first question had quietly changed into something the people who first asked it never meant. It started as which group carries Neanderthal DNA. The honest answer turned out to be all of them. Every human group on Earth that has been tested carries Neanderthal DNA. There is no group standing outside this. The line that was supposed to separate the carriers from everyone else does not run between continents, and it does not run between groups. It does not exist. There was one piece left, and it came in December 2024. Two studies, one in the journal Science and one in Nature, set out to pin down exactly when the main mixing happened. One team, including Priya Morjani at Berkeley, worked from a large set of present-day and ancient DNA samples. The other studied some of the oldest modern human DNA ever read, from skeletons found at Ranis in Germany and at a site called Zlatý Kun in the Czech Republic, both around 45,000 years old. They reached the same answer on their own. The Neanderthal DNA that nearly every non-African alive carries today traces back to one long stretch of mixing. It began around 50,500 years ago and lasted roughly 7,000 years. One long pulse, not a sprinkle of random meetings across a continent and across the ages. One window, one shared ancestor group, and then it closed. And those studies found something else worth holding on to. Scattered across human DNA, there are long stretches the scientists call Neanderthal deserts. Areas where Neanderthal DNA is completely missing, in everyone, and where it seems to have been wiped out shockingly fast after the mixing ended. The most likely reason is that some Neanderthal gene versions were simply harmful in a human body. Natural selection scrubbed them out within a few thousand years. So the 2% that survived is not a random sample of Neanderthal DNA. It is the part that was harmless or useful and earned the right to stay. In other words, the DNA did its own editing. For 7,000 years, the two groups mixed, and then for thousands of years after that, selection quietly worked through the results, keeping what helped and throwing out what hurt. What every living person carries today is not the raw, untouched record of that contact. It is the edited cut, the version that survived 47,000 years of testing. Which brings us back to the question in the title, and to why the simple version of it falls apart the moment you look closely. If you ask which group carries the most Neanderthal DNA, the technically correct answer is East Asian groups, with Native American groups in a near-exact tie alongside them. The number is real. Around 54 megabases against roughly 49 for Europeans. It is worth clearing up one common mix-up here. You will sometimes see it claimed that Melanesian groups, the people of Papua New Guinea and the nearby islands, carry the most ancient human DNA of any group alive. That part is actually true, but most of that extra DNA is not Neanderthal. It comes from the Denisovans, a separate ancient human species, and Melanesians carry a very heavy dose of them, far more than anyone else. Take the Denisovan part out and look at Neanderthal DNA on its own, and Melanesians fall back into roughly the same range as Europeans. For the Neanderthal question on its own, East Asia still holds the top of the list. But every layer underneath that answer pushes back against treating it as a ranking. East Asians sit at the top not because their ancestors had some special closeness to Neanderthals, but because a tide of farmers never washed away what they had inherited. Europeans sit lower because of a migration that happened 10,000 years ago and had nothing to do with Neanderthals at all. Africans were assumed to sit at 0, and that turned out to be a flaw in the tool, not a fact about the people. And the deeper you go, the more the differences between groups shrink into something almost meaningless. The real headline was never the gap, it was the thing every group has in common. 2% here, a little more there, a little less somewhere else. A fraction of a percent in groups once written off as 0. These numbers are not the borders between peoples. They are the small, uneven echoes of one event that happened to a single shared ancestor group around 47,000 years ago, scattered and reshuffled by every migration that came after. And that is the part worth carrying out of this. The science started by asking a question about difference. Who has more? Who has less? Who comes out on top? It spent 15 years answering that question. And the answer it produced quietly took the question itself apart. The Neanderthal in us is not a marker that sorts people into groups. It is a thread that runs through all of it, thicker in some places, thinner in others, but unbroken. A reminder that the human story was never a single clean line, it was always a braid. The Neanderthals did not simply vanish 40,000 years ago. Not entirely. They lost their tools, their language, their faces, their own separate life as a people. But a sliver of them was absorbed into the species that replaced them, and it has been riding inside us ever since, copied faithfully into billions of cells in every group on the planet. We like to tell the story of human origins as a story of one species winning and another losing. The DNA tells a quieter version. The other branch did not just lose. Part of it crossed over, and it is still here. In East Asian DNA, in European DNA, in African DNA, in yours. The only thing the science ever really argued about was how much, never whether. If this is the kind of story you came here for, the kind where the answer turns out stranger and bigger than the question, subscribe, because next week we are opening the file on the Denisovans, the third human species hiding in our DNA, and the one group on Earth that carries so much of them it changes how their bodies are built. The video on screen breaks down another piece of the human origin story that mainstream science is only now catching up to. Click it.